Let me introduce Sue Gerhardt. She's a practicing psychotherapist, co-founder of a charity called the Oxford Parent-Infant Project that provides psychotherapy support for families and their babies. Well known as the author of Why Love Matters and her recently published book, The Selfish Society. Sue.
Thank you very much, Monica. I'm really pleased to be here. I've never actually heard of Play Therapy International before, and it's a marvellous organisation, I can see. So it seems to have become my sort of mission in life, through my books and my professional work, to bring the importance of babyhood to people's attention. I certainly feel passionate about it, as Mike said. But perhaps some of you might be wondering why you, as play therapists, should be interested in babies. So I think perhaps the first and most obvious answer is that I think it's very helpful for all clinicians to understand the roots of mental well-being and, of course, mental distress. It's now well established that our earliest experiences shape the way we regulate our emotions, and they even shape our brains in ways that are often played out for the rest of our lives. I described all this in my first book, Why Love Matters, and I will be reminding you of just how this works in my talk today. I'm also hoping to give you some idea of why very early intervention is so important, and even possibly encourage more of you to consider whether you too might be able to support or even practice earlier forms of intervention. There might be ways that some of you could bring babies more directly into your work. For example, there was going to be, and sadly apparently this is not happening now, a very interesting workshop tomorrow which was going to describe some groundbreaking work which Monica's already mentioned with malnourished children. And the work seemed to be about how essential it was to provide emotional nourishment and to keep the emotional bond between parent and child going if you want the child to take in physical nourishment. And I don't know what ages this project actually works with, but I could see this approach working with babies under 2, just as well as with the over 3s. But I also believe that babyhood is important for everyone, not just therapists, because I think that the way we care for babies affects the kind of society we create too. And this is something that I explore in my new book, The Selfish Society. I'm not going to elaborate on these wider issues at great length today, but I think, just to put it in a nutshell, that many basic social values are passed on unconsciously already in babyhood. Adults convey a great deal to babies about the kind of society they're living in. At the most basic level, for example, whether their world is supportive and safe or challenging and dangerous. And all of us, in different ways, are working with the unloving side of society, in a way, and trying to find ways to offer a more caring response. And particularly those people who are working in Africa are often doing really cutting-edge work in dealing with traumatic social problems, such as the AIDS epidemic, the aftermath of war, homelessness, and so on. Whilst probably the majority of you who've actually made it here today are pouring your creative energy into, I'm sure, wonderful but probably more tried and tested kind of projects. My own work takes place in Oxford, as Monica said, where my colleagues and I have developed our own eclectic mix of video feedback and watch, wait and wonder alongside traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy. The families we help are not generally facing life and death issues, but are struggling with a range of problems, which could be from premature birth, disability, adoption, to emotional neglect and abuse in the family. So given such a wide range of experiences, can we really generalise about how we might create a more loving society by working with children and families? I think we can, because I believe that you can't have a caring society without ensuring that everyone is mentally and emotionally equipped to care for others. And I think the basic equipment we need for that, empathy, self-control and foresight, for example, is the same for human beings the world over. Although there are cultural variations, our basic processes of emotional development are the same. As John Bowlby pointed out long ago, we are all social animals who share with mammals certain ways of relating to each other and getting our attachment needs met. And in recent years, his theories have been confirmed by scientists in a range of disciplines, such as neuroscience, neurobiology, and developmental psychology, who've added new information about how this actually works within our bodies and our brains. I think this information is incredibly useful because it can help us to figure out how we can best help children clinically. And I think it can give us a deeper confidence in what we're doing too. So my aim this morning is to give you a clearer picture of what's going on in babyhood and what a baby is learning emotionally. But as well as presenting some scientific information, I've tried to integrate it with some images of my work with babies so that you get a glimpse of how issues of play and social interaction are present from the start of life. So let's start with a very young baby. All of us start life, like this baby, driven by our emotions and our bodily states. New babies just tend to kind of react to stress in an unthinking, bodily way by crying or by kicking or by avoiding unpleasant things. They also, although they're very communicative, they communicate in a rather primitive way. That's to say, without a very precise sense of the other person, as yet. And a baby can't manage his stressful experiences for himself. He depends on adults to do it for him. But the way adults do this has a huge impact. In fact, I think it has a huge cultural significance too, because the way adults handle babies tells the baby a huge amount about how he or she should manage feelings in this particular family or this particular culture. In more collective or rural societies, babies are usually, I think, in a good position to have their stress well managed. Whether the setting is an African village group or a Middle Eastern extended family, in stable times at least, they will be integrated into a manageable, small social group of people who support the mother and also hold the baby and play with him or her. And in turn, mothers who feel well supported usually are able to give good support to their babies. When babies are kept close to their mother's bodies and breastfed on demand, the baby has a comfortable feeling of continuity with his prenatal life and develops an expectation that he will be responded to quickly. And I think as a result, these babies learn to trust their social group and are able to feel relaxed and confident in other people because they expect other people to respond to them. However, in urban societies, mothers are much less well supported and in the West, often very isolated in their homes and unsure how to respond to their babies. They tend to breastfeed much less. There are endless debates about whether babies will be spoilt if parents respond quickly to the baby and whether it's safe to sleep with them. And in the West, babies are mostly expected to sleep without the comfort of a warm body and often have to manage the anxiety of sleeping in a separate room or by themselves. In these Western cultures, in our Western cultures probably, there's an emphasis on intellectual and material achievement. So a lot of thought can go into decorating a baby's room or into stimulating baby's intelligence. I don't know if you've seen this is apparently the latest thing, very popular. But there may be less confidence in the value of just comforting and holding. Some babies are left to cry for a relatively long period of time. A practice which I think gives them the message that they can't depend on other people being there when needed. But all this, I think, probably prepares children for the kind of society in which they're expected to be independent and able to pursue their own individual goals without support from a social group. So you can see that babies are already getting quite a lot of information about their parents' attitudes to emotion and how to manage their emotions. But on top of these cultural factors, individual parents can, of course, be better or worse equipped to care for their babies. When babies are ignored or maltreated or separated from their attachment figures for longer than they can manage, they release high levels of the stress hormone cortisol. Right. Now, cortisol is very useful, and it's really designed to cope with sort of emergencies in a way. But if it becomes the normal experience, babies their brains have to find a way to adapt and to adjust to the permanently high levels of cortisol. And this can set them up to be more reactive to stress in future life. It's the day in, day out quality of care which really shapes the brain, and especially the quality of the relationships that babies have. What really damages a child's ability to cope is the experience of having his or her needs ignored or rejected. And obviously this can take many forms. It could be a mother who tries to protect herself from pain by withdrawing emotionally from a starving child. It could be a depressed mother who turns away from life altogether. Or it could be a mother who projects her negative feelings about herself onto her baby. There's some recent research by somebody called Ma Sanchez, who found that all kinds of emotional rejection have a strong impact on another biochemical system, the serotonin system. And this might not be surprising because the job of this biochemical system is to enable us to be calm and to relax. Some people have called it the soothing system. But parents aren't necessarily aware of the emotional messages that they're conveying through their body language, through their tone of voice, their way of moving, how quickly they respond, the look in their eyes, and so on. These things are unconscious and are conveyed largely from right brain to right brain at a speed which is far faster than conscious and deliberate forms of communication. So when we looked at this together the following week, the mother saw for the first time that her son wasn't rejecting her, she was rejecting him and ignoring him. And together we looked at this bit of material and we tried to think together about what his play was telling her about, what it was revealing about the unconscious messages he was giving her. And she began to see how Robbie was actually showing her in so many ways, in even this tiny little clip, how much he wanted nurture. I mean, first of all, he was lying under the baby gym, as if he was trying to be a baby. And then he was feeding a doll, I don't know if you noticed that. And then he was feeding himself frantically, trying to drink from the cup. And just being able to sort of notice and see some of these things was a really big revelation to her. And it changed the way she felt about him. She, even in this one session, or two actually, because the feedback happened the following week, she suddenly realised that he needed her. And, I mean, maybe she was already sort of thinking about this and was ready to do this, but she decided to set time aside to spend with him on his own. And within weeks, very, very quickly, she started to enjoy being with him, and the things started to turn around. So this was a very small intervention, but a really quite a powerful one for this particular family. But even though he was only 3, this child's experiences of rejection could well have already put him at risk of future anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. There's some recent research by Kaplow and Widom, which has found that the earlier the maltreatment, the more prone children are to these internalizing types of disorder. And I suspect this may be because this is the stage when their stress response and their soothing response, these biochemical systems, are being established. So if these basic things go wrong, I think their emotional foundations and their ability to deal with stress in the future could then be shaky. Despite everything, this little boy was still trying to get a response from his mother, and luckily he did eventually get one. But when children's emotional needs go on being rejected or ignored, children may give up on getting their feelings heard and turn instead to aggressive solutions instead of these more depressive ones. And Kaplow and Widom again found that after the age of 3, maltreatment tends to lead not only to mood disorders, but also to aggressive behaviours. And although actually both of them involve low levels of serotonin. James is probably typical of lots of poorly regulated children who then go on to find it really hard to handle stress, who are uncooperative, lack self-control, and relate poorly to others. Early biochemistry, I think, plays a big part in this. But then there's also the fact that his mother is failing to model good ways of regulating himself. And when she loses it and starts to act violently, the mirror neurons in James's brain will start firing off in response to his mother's actions. That's what mirror neurons, they respond to action. And that will give him a pretty good idea inside his own body of how it feels to be enraged and frustrated, but actually not a clue about how it feels to be restrained. And self-control is also something which is learnt extremely early. There's a researcher called Grażyna Kochanska who's done a lot of research on this, and she found in various pieces of research that the level of self-control at 2 tends to predict it at 3, and then at 4, and so on. Okay, so these very early experiences of being responded to or not definitely affect our biochemical makeup. but they also begin to shape brain structure as well. And in particular, they can affect how well the social brain develops. And this also plays a part in James's ability to manage his impulsive reactions. So if Carol doesn't model self-control or demand it from James, it's unlikely that his brain would be able to consolidate the neural pathways between what Margot Sunderland has called the higher and the lower brain. And the pathways between these two play a big part in controlling emotional behaviour. What I call the social brain is mostly based in the prefrontal area of the brain, which is sort of basically behind the eyes and in the front there. This is a rather unique part of the higher brain. It kind of specialises in managing the lower brain. The lower brain being a sort of slang way of referring to those things in the centre of the brain there, the amygdala, and the other things around the amygdala, hypothalamus and so on. And the lower brain, incidentally, is involved in a lot of those biochemical responses I've just been talking about. Anyway, one of the earliest parts of the higher brain to develop is the part which plays a very central role in emotional life, the early developing middle part of the prefrontal cortex, which includes the orbitofrontal cortex. So you can see there roughly where it is. This area is really useful in taking our basic emotional reactions to a kind of higher level. It provides a kind of platform in the mind where we can start to view ourselves and develop a perspective on our lower brain emotions. It's really basically where we start to think about our feelings. And it also helps us to manage our more primitive feelings. So it can suppress the stress response and calm strong feelings like fear or anger, which tend to be triggered or generated by the amygdala in the lower brain. Just as an aside, there's another part of the higher brain, by the way, which helps with self-control too, but that's a slightly later area, later developing area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which I'm not going to go into now, but it helps with holding information in our minds. And Daniel Siegel actually, I think, has called it a pause button. It kind of helps us wait before we act. Anyway, I mean, it looked like James might be having problems with both of these higher brain functions. But that wasn't because James was genetically made that way. Whatever was happening to his social brain was the result of his actual social experiences. Alan Shaw was probably the first to point out that the more we respond to each other in sensitive and playful and pleasurable ways, the more this medial prefrontal area of the brain develops. And he suggests that the way this works is that when we're enjoying our relationships, various biochemicals are triggered off, which are different from those biochemicals that I've already mentioned, which are triggered by stress. In particular, positive relationships activate a substance called dopamine, and this in turn releases pleasurable biochemicals called opioids in the baby's brain. And in the first 2 years of life, these chemicals are travelling up the new neural pathways into the developing prefrontal cortex, which is just beginning to get established. And they have what's called a growth-promoting role there. So they literally help the social or the higher brain to grow and connect up. Stressful experiences, on the other hand, like the ones that James was experiencing, do the opposite. When there's too much cortisol and too much dopamine in the prefrontal area, they can be toxic to these brain connections. But as I hope it's become clear, James and Nilly and Robbie could only develop a strong sense of self, an ability to cope with the stresses of life, and a capacity for empathy as well, if their caregivers notice their feelings and respond to them, particularly during this crucial early phase of brain and body development. In my view, all roads lead back to these earliest relationships, because this is when we learn those basic things that help us to manage ourselves and our relationships well. So I believe that if we want a more caring and compassionate society, or even world, we must give a much greater priority to helping all children to get this basic emotional equipment. As I describe in greater detail in The Selfish Society, this matters at all levels of society. In my view, politicians, businessmen, and bankers who haven't got much empathy and awareness can be just as much of a menace as those at the bottom of the social order who resort to antisocial behaviour or addiction or whatever to deal with their lack of connection to others. We will need more empathy and awareness of others, in fact, if we want to create a more loving global society, which is going to be capable of dealing with these huge and unacceptable economic inequalities between nations and the dangerous problems of climate change that are facing us. But these social qualities of empathy and self-control and the ability to manage conflict don't come from thin air. They are learnt in our very earliest relationships.
The work I do isn't strictly speaking play therapy, but I do work with mothers and babies, parents and babies, doing something called Watch, Wait and Wonder, which is very similar, I think. It's very much about non-verbal interaction, and I do work with parents from different cultural backgrounds in Britain, and I guess it's effective with whoever, because you're operating in that kind of non-verbal language, yeah. I think that love is a word that people tend to associate with a sort of feeling that they have. But actually, I think love is a practice. It's the way of reaching out to other people, of connecting with people, and noticing how they feel and responding to them. And it would be good if we could all get better at it. I think that ultimately what's going to make a real difference to society, or even to the world as a whole, is the quality of relationships. And so the work that we are doing as therapists, might seem to be just about particular individuals and their relationships, but I think it has potential to transform the world.